Ladies and gentlemen, to today's video, we're diving into a powerful story that unfolds inside a courthouse, where one man's experience exposes the truth about justice, discrimination, and the power of standing up for what's right. Stick with us as we break down what happens when things don't go according to plan and how one person's persistence can turn the tide. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comments section. Your support will help us bring more meaningful stories like this. The courthouse was already a scene of organized chaos by the time Darrell Carter stepped through the heavy glass doors. Monday mornings at Jefferson County Courthouse were always a mess. The constant flurry of activity was enough to make even the most seasoned visitors feel a bit overwhelmed. Lawyers rushed in and out of the building, their footsteps quick and purposeful as court clerks at the check-in desk stacked piles of papers, filing away the latest updates for cases. The faint hum of whispered conversations bounced off the high marble walls, mixing with the occasional clatter of a dropped file or the rustle of papers. The air was thick with the musty scent of old law books, mingling with the bitter aroma of burnt coffee from the nearby break room. Now and then a rush of perfume from an overworked paralegal would cut through the air, briefly masking the usual courthouse smells. Darrell had been to this courthouse many times before, but never as a defendant, nor as a plaintiff. No, Darrell was a businessman caught in an endless legal battle over a contract dispute that, in his mind, should have been settled months ago. But the wheels of justice turned slowly, and this particular wheel had become far too familiar to him. He was prepared, dressed to impress in a sharp, tailored gray suit, a navy blue tie perfectly knotted at his throat, and a polished brown leather briefcase tucked securely under his arm. This wasn't his first rodeo in the legal system, and he'd learned to navigate the unpredictable twists and turns of courtroom proceedings. Or so he thought. The line at the check-in desk was moving quickly. People shuffled forward one by one, handing over their paperwork to the officers behind the desk. Each person received a brief nod or an absent-minded glance before being waved through the double doors leading to their assigned courtrooms. Some walked away with satisfied smiles, eager to put their cases behind them. Others, their faces tight with stress, hurried off to face whatever judgment awaited them, their fates hanging in the balance. When it was his turn, Darrell stepped up to the desk and handed over his paperwork, offering a polite but firm "Carter, Darrell," as he did. The officer, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, barely looked up from the papers he was flipping through. He scanned Darrell's documents for what felt like an eternity, and then, without warning, there was a strange pause, a moment of hesitation that lingered too long for comfort. Darrell had seen this before, though he rarely acknowledged it. The officer cleared his throat, his eyes now locking with Darrell's for the first time. "You'll have to wait outside," the officer said curtly. Darrell blinked, taken aback. "Outside?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. The officer, whose face remained impassive, offered a vague, lazy wave toward a row of metal benches near the far wall. "Yeah, over there by the benches." His tone was final, his words leaving no room for negotiation. Darrell turned, following the officer's gesture, his mind already racing with questions. A few people were already seated, their bodies restless and fidgeting as they stared at their phones or shifted in their seats. They were the kind of people still waiting for their cases to be heard, their names yet to be called. Darrell glanced back at the officer, trying to make sense of the situation. "I was told my hearing starts at 9 sharp, he explained, pointing toward the doors through which others were being waved. "Everyone else is going in." The officer didn't even look up from his desk this time. "They'll call you when they're ready." His tone was dismissive, almost mechanical, as if this was just part of the routine. It felt as though Darrell's presence was an inconvenience, something he'd have to wait to be dealt with at the officer's leisure. Darrell hesitated for a brief moment. His gut instinct told him to push back, to demand an explanation for why he was being singled out. But he had been in enough legal situations to know that pushing too hard in moments like these could escalate things unnecessarily. The wrong move could turn a minor inconvenience into something far worse. So, with a forced calm, he gave a small nod, accepted his paperwork, and made his way over to the benches. As he walked, his eyes scanned the people seated there, and it didn't take long for him to notice something unsettling. People who looked like him, middle-aged black men dressed in business attire, were the ones waiting. Everyone else, the middle-aged white men and women in their neatly pressed clothes, was being ushered straight through the doors. Daryl's stomach tightened, but he sat down anyway. The cold, hard metal of the bench seemed to press into him as he positioned himself as comfortably as he could. He checked his watch. 8:47 a.m. Still early, he thought. Maybe this was just part of the process, just an administrative shuffle. But as the minutes ticked by, he found it harder and harder to dismiss the growing unease in his gut. The pattern continued. A middle-aged white man in a navy blue polo and khakis walked up to the same check-in desk, holding a thick manila folder. The officer barely glanced at his paperwork before sending him through without so much as a second thought. The entire interaction lasted no more than 15 seconds. A young blonde woman, no older than 25, followed, dressed in a beige pencil skirt and a white blouse. She handed over her paperwork, the officer scanned it with a smile, and she was sent through just as quickly. 10 seconds, maybe less. Daryl swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around the edge of his briefcase, and his eyes darted back toward the bench, where he could feel the weight of the others' gazes on him. They were all waiting, just like him. But something felt off. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, each second adding to the tension in his chest. Maybe there was a reason, he thought. Maybe his paperwork needed more time to be processed. Maybe. But with every passing minute, that maybe felt less and less likely. "Excuse me, sir, has your name been called yet?" Daryl turned at the sound of the voice. A man sat 2 seats down from him, dressed in a brown suit, his hair speckled with gray at the temples. He had the air of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. His forehead creased from years of furrowing, deep lines around his mouth, etched by countless hours of hard negotiations and arguments, and a gaze that had witnessed more hearings than it cared to remember. Daryl shook his head. "No, I've been told to wait out here." The man hummed thoughtfully, tapping a finger rhythmically on the armrest. "What's your case?" he asked, voice steady. "Business dispute," Daryl replied curtly, not feeling the need to go into detail. The man nodded sagely as if he already had the answer. "I had a feeling," he said, eyes narrowing as he glanced Daryl up and down. Daryl frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked, a slight edge creeping into his voice. Before the man could respond, another figure approached the check-in desk. A black woman in a striking red blazer, a small folder clutched in her hand. The officer behind the desk barely glanced at her, muttering something indistinct and waving her off with a short motion of his hand, directing her toward the benches. She sighed deeply, the weight of the situation clear on her face, but she said nothing. With a steady but practiced grace, she walked over and sat down at the far end of the bench, pulling out her phone and scrolling aimlessly. But her jaw was set, a subtle, controlled tightness that spoke volumes. She knew exactly what was going on here. The minutes dragged on. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Daryl watched, his stomach tightening with each passing moment as more people filed into the courthouse. Some walked straight through, barely exchanging a word as they were waved into the back. But others, mostly black, a few Latino, were told to wait. His pulse quickened. It was too obvious now. This wasn't a series of coincidences. There was something systemic happening here. Then, at exactly 9:15 a.m., a man rushed in through the door, looking harried. He was a balding white man in a pricey charcoal suit, muttering to himself about being late. Without breaking stride, he waved a folder in the air and approached the officer. "Courtroom B, right?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. The officer barely glanced up before nodding, lifting the rope to let him through. "Go on in, Mr. Hayes." Darrell felt his chest tighten. He couldn't let this slide any longer. He jumped to his feet. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice calm but carrying a firmness that made the officer pause. The officer glanced over, his irritation barely concealed. "What about me?" Darrell asked, holding up his paperwork. "I've been waiting for almost 45 minutes. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment one below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." The officer sighed heavily, clearly put out by the interruption. He flipped through a stack of papers, searching for something to distract him. Then, without even meeting Darrell's gaze, he said flatly, "You'll be called when they're ready." Darrell's patience snapped. "You just let that man through without even checking his name," he said, his voice rising slightly. The officer's eyes finally met his, and there was something about the look, something dismissive, almost smug, that made Darrell's stomach turn. "You need to calm down, sir," the officer said, his tone patronizing. Darrell's jaw clenched, his fists tightening by his sides. The words weren't just a suggestion. They were a warning, an attempt to put him in his place. The tension in the air thickened, almost suffocating. He could feel the eyes of the others in the room on him, some watching with quiet curiosity, others pretending not to notice. Just then, the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open and the air shifted. A woman in a black robe stepped through, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone who had seen it all. She locked eyes with Darrell almost immediately. "What are you still doing out here?" Her voice sliced through the silence, cold and commanding. Conversations hushed instantly, and even the officer who had been so dismissive moments ago stiffened, his posture suddenly more rigid. Darrell turned toward the judge, recognizing her immediately. It was Judge Lorraine Whitaker, known for her no-nonsense attitude and her ability to command a courtroom with an iron fist. She was the kind of judge you didn't want to cross, but she also wasn't one to tolerate anything that didn't meet her standards. She was watching him, waiting for a response. Darrell cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "I was told to wait out here, Your Honor." Her eyebrows furrowed, a sharp crease appearing between them. "By who?" she asked, her voice as firm as steel. Every set of eyes in the hallway shifted toward the officer. He hesitated, and for a moment, Darrell could see the panic flicker in his eyes. He quickly flipped through a stack of papers, pretending to be busy, hoping the situation would blow over. But Judge Whitaker wasn't buying it. "Officer Sanders," she began, her voice calm but the dangerous lull before the storm, "is there a reason this gentleman hasn't been allowed inside?" The officer looked up, feigning indifference, but there was no hiding the discomfort in his posture now. "His paperwork must not have been processed yet, Your Honor." Judge Whitaker didn't flinch. She extended a hand toward Sanders, her sharp gaze never leaving him. "Give it to me." The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Every eye in the room focused on the officer, who could no longer avoid the scrutiny. With forced nonchalance, Sanders grabbed Darrell's folder and handed it over. Judge Whitaker flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. Seconds ticked by, 5, 10, and then her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. She looked up at Sanders, her gaze so intense it could have shattered glass. "This has been stamped and cleared for over an hour," she said, her voice low but laced with ice. "Why hasn't he been sent in?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Darrell felt his pulse pounding in his ears, every fiber of his being alert and tense. Sanders adjusted his belt awkwardly, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Must have been an oversight, Your Honor." Darrell's jaw clenched. He wanted to speak, wanted to call this out for what it was, but he knew better. A wrong move could make everything turn against him. Judge Whitaker inhaled slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room. A few attorneys had poked their heads out from the courtroom, sensing the tension building. The others on the benches, some who had been waiting just as long as he had, were watching intently. She turned back to Sanders. "An oversight?" Her voice was a cold sand harp, and her eyes narrowed as if daring him to repeat the lie. Sanders, now visibly sweating, nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." The judge closed the folder with a deliberate motion, tapping the edge lightly against her palm before speaking. But her words weren't directed at Sanders. No, she was addressing someone else. "Mr. Carter, come with me." Without a moment's hesitation, Darrell grabbed his briefcase and stood up, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. As he followed her through the double doors, he could feel the weight of every eye in the room fixed on his back. Each stare seemed to pin him in place, a silent scrutiny he couldn't escape. But just as he crossed the threshold, a voice rang out from behind him, cold and threatening. "This isn't over." He didn't have to turn around to know who had spoken. He recognized that voice, the venom in it, the finality in the tone. And with a heavy certainty settling in his chest, Darrell understood that whatever came next would change everything. The moment Darrell stepped into the courtroom, the contrast was immediate, jarring even. It was like being hit with a wall of suffocating order and power. The hallway had been filled with chaos, people hustling in every direction, tension crackling in the air. But this room was different. It was still methodical, almost clinical in its organization. The weight of authority hung thickly in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. Rows of polished wooden benches stretched out in front of him, each seat occupied by someone with a quiet but palpable sense of purpose. Attorneys murmured to one another in a hushed tone, as though even their words could be weighed and measured. Clerks bustled between desks, their movements swift and precise. And standing near the judge's bench, a bailiff stood rigid, hands clasped in front of him like some unyielding statue. But all of this, the furniture, the people, the sounds, none of it mattered as Judge Whittaker made her way toward the bench. Her stride was measured, purposeful, and as she walked, the entire room seemed to straighten in response, a collective acknowledgement of her power. Darrell fell in line behind her, each step heavier than the last. The eyes of the courtroom shifted toward him, an unspoken question in the air: who is this man, and why is the judge personally escorting him into the room? The whisper of thoughts seemed to grow louder in his ears, but he kept his head high, his focus trained on Judge Whittaker. As she took her seat at the bench, she adjusted the microphone in front of her, then turned her steely gaze toward the officer standing stiffly by the door. "Bailiff, please call the next case." The bailiff nodded and opened a file, his voice carrying across the room with practiced professionalism. "Case? No, 24178, Carter versus Reynard Holdings." Darrell let out a slow breath, his fingers adjusting the knot of his tie. It was time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he moved forward, placing his briefcase on the plaintiff's table. His attorney, a sharp, meticulous man in his early 50s, leaned in, his voice low but steady. "Everything good?" Darrell forced a smile, though it felt like a mask, thin and brittle. "Let's just get this over with." Across from him, the legal team representing Reynard Holdings made their way to their seats, their movements so synchronized they could have been rehearsed. They were all dressed in perfectly tailored gray suits, looking every bit the part of corporate power players. Their lead counsel, William Crestwell, settled into his seat with a practiced ease, the corners of his lips curled into a smirk. Darrell had seen that expression before. It was the one men like Crestwell wore when they felt untouchable, when they believed the game was rigged in their favor, the kind of smirk that said, "I'm already ahead." But just as the proceedings were about to begin, Judge Whittaker raised a hand and the room fell silent, as though the very air had been drawn out of the space. Every eye turned toward her, every ear straining to catch her next words. "Before we proceed, I need to address something." Darrell's stomach tightened. He could feel it. The moment he had been dreading. Whitaker leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the desk, and her gaze locked onto him. "Mr. Carter, it has come to my attention that you were made to wait outside for an extended period, despite your case being scheduled for 9 a.m. Is that correct?" Darrell's pulse skipped, but he only hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor." A low murmur rippled through the room. A few attorneys exchanged confused glances, and even Crestwell's smirk faltered, his brows knitting together in a faint but telling sign of unease. Whitaker turned her attention to the bailiff, her gaze as sharp as a blade. "Officer Sanders was responsible for checking this morning, correct?" The bailiff nodded quickly, his voice unwavering. "Yes, ma'am." The judge exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the courtroom doors. "Officer Sanders, step inside." If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The room fell into an eerie silence. It felt as though the entire building held its breath. A few seconds passed, and the doors creaked open. Officer Sanders stepped into the room, his posture stiff, his face betraying a flicker of nervousness. Whitaker didn't break her gaze as she gestured toward the empty witness stand. "Take a seat." Darrell's heart rate quickened. This was not how courtroom proceedings usually went, not at all. Sanders hesitated for just a moment, his eyes flicking around the room before he moved toward the stand, his steps slow, deliberate, as if he was trying to buy time to come up with a defense that would make the situation disappear. Whitaker laced her fingers together, her expression unreadable. "Officer Sanders, why was Mr. Carter told to wait outside?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of tension. Sanders cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edge of the stand a little too tightly. "It was a mistake, Your Honor. An oversight. With all the cases coming through this morning, sometimes things get mixed up." Whitaker's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's interesting," she said, tapping a pen against the desk, her expression inscrutable. "Because I checked his file. It was cleared and stamped for court before he even arrived." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Whispers filled the room once again, this time louder, more frantic. Darrell could see the uncomfortable shift in the Reynard Holdings attorneys' seats, their confident facades beginning to crack. Whitaker's voice grew colder, the authority in it unmistakable. "I'll ask again, why was he made to wait?" Sanders opened his mouth as though to respond, but no words came out. He hesitated, his gaze flickering uneasily before he closed his lips as though searching for something to say. For the first time since the questioning began, he appeared unsure, vulnerable even, and in that fleeting moment of uncertainty, Darrell realized something crucial. The entire courtroom wasn't just watching Sanders, they were holding their breath, waiting for an answer that would either confirm or deny what they all suspected. The silence stretched, a taut wire ready to snap. Judge Whitaker let the tension linger in the air, her eyes never leaving Sanders as she slowly leaned forward, her voice a low, dangerous murmur. "I suggest you choose your words very carefully." The atmosphere in the courtroom grew dense, like a storm about to break. The silence felt heavy, pressing down on everyone. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through, suffocating, but no one dared break it. The room was still, every person present aware that something significant was about to unfold. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Sanders spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't personal." His words hung in the air, and at that moment the entire courtroom seemed to inhale as one. It was as if they were all waiting to exhale, to process what had just been revealed, even though it wasn't yet clear what it meant. Judge Whitaker's face remained impassive, her expression a mask of controlled authority. "Explain," she said evenly, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. Sanders shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado crumbling, leaving him smaller, almost insignificant. His eyes flickered, avoiding the gaze of those around him. "I was just following protocol," he muttered, his voice lacking conviction. A harsh, derisive scoff came from somewhere in the gallery. Darrell, who had been silently observing, finally leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with frustration. "What protocol, Officer Sanders?" he asked, his words steady yet full of challenge. Sanders took a sharp breath, clearly rattled, and his fingers drummed nervously against the wood of the witness stand. "We're told to be cautious with certain cases," he replied, though the words seemed to hang in the air, incomplete, vague. The courtroom reacted immediately. A wave of low murmurs rippled through the room, heads shaking in disbelief, a collective shift in energy as everyone started to connect the dots. Whitaker's voice was low, commanding, and full of steel. "Cautious in what way, Officer Sanders?" she demanded, her patience wearing thin. For a brief moment Sanders faltered. His eyes darted uneasily toward the attorneys representing Reynard Holdings, the slightest flicker of recognition passing between them. It was barely perceptible, but Darrell caught it. The connection was clear now. Whitaker, too, had seen it. Her gaze sharpened, her posture shifting as she leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. "Are you implying that a decision was made to deliberately delay Mr. Carter's hearing based on instructions you received?" she asked, her voice cold but cutting. Sanders froze, his eyes wide, the weight of the question pressing down on him. The room was silent again, each person waiting for his response. And then, under the pressure of the moment, the dam broke. "I was told to slow things down, to hold certain people back," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words fell from his lips, soft but carrying an undeniable weight. The courtroom's reaction was instant, a sharp intake of breath followed by a cascade of gasps. The murmurs grew louder, a ripple of shock and disbelief sweeping through the gallery. Whitaker's jaw tightened, her gaze narrowing as she absorbed what Sanders had just revealed. "Told by who?" Whitaker's voice was ice with a razor-sharp edge to it. Sanders exhaled through his nose, his face flushing crimson with embarrassment or guilt, perhaps both. "One of the attorneys on the Reynard Holdings team," he admitted, his voice small. "They said it would be better if Mr. Carter's case was delayed a bit." Revelation hit Darrell like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened, his heart racing. He turned slowly toward the opposing table, his gaze locking on William Crestwell, whose previously confident, almost smug demeanor had evaporated. The man sat frozen, his smirk wiped clean from his face, replaced by an expression of utter disbelief and panic. Judge Whitaker turned her gaze toward Crestwell with surgical precision. "Mr. Crestwell," she said, her tone deadly calm, but the underlying fury was undeniable. For the first time that morning, Crestwell faltered. He leaned forward in his seat, his palms flat on the table, his breath quickening. Then, in a voice that came out too tight, too forced, he tried to laugh, but it was hollow. "Your Honor, I have no idea what this man is talking about," he said. But the words sounded rehearsed, desperate. And in that moment, Darrell knew it wasn't just a courtroom drama unfolding before him. It was a carefully orchestrated move, one that had just begun to unravel. Darrell's eyes never left Crestwell, his mind racing in overdrive. He could feel it, the undeniable truth that Crestwell was lying. The way his shoulders tensed, his eyes shifting nervously, the subtle but telling flick of his hands. It all screamed deception. Every inch of his posture screamed guilt. The moment dragged on as if time itself had stalled, and Judge Whitaker allowed the silence to stretch, drawing out the tension in the air. Finally she exhaled, her gaze hardening as she turned back to Officer Sanders. "Officer Sanders, you are under oath," she said, her voice stern. "I will ask you one last time. Did Mr. Crestwell, or anyone from his firm, instruct you to delay Mr. Carter's case?" The room was deathly quiet. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. and the weight of the question hung in the air. Then, with great reluctance, Sanders finally nodded. Yes. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The sharp intakes of breath echoed through the room. Some attorneys whispered fiercely to one another, and a woman in the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth in shock. The tension that had been building for so long finally cracked, and in its wake the realization that the entire courtroom had just been thrust into an entirely new chapter set in. The consequences were now inevitable, charging toward them with unstoppable force. Judge Whittaker leaned back in her chair, her finger drumming rhythmically against her desk, signaling the shift in the room's energy. The air had changed, and she wasted no time. She turned to the court clerk with a chilling command. "Make a note in the record. I will be addressing this misconduct in full after these proceedings." Crestwell's face paled, his usual arrogance faltering as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The other attorneys from Reynard Holdings fidgeted, exchanging wary glances, sensing that this case had just spiraled into something they weren't prepared for. Darrell remained still, his heart pounding in his chest, but now the adrenaline was mixed with something else, the unmistakable feeling that, for the first time in a long time, the power had shifted, and it was no longer in Crestwell's hands. As Judge Whittaker resumed her position, preparing to continue the hearing, the entire courtroom knew that what had just been revealed was only the beginning of something much bigger. For the first time since the hearing began, William Crestwell remained silent. The buzz in the courtroom was palpable, whispers rippling through the room like an electric current. Even the judge, whose demeanor had been unflappable until now, let the moment hang. She gave everyone in the room a chance to process the gravity of what had just come to light. Darrell's hands were clasped tightly together as he replayed the events in his mind. Every look of dismissal, every smirk, every word spoken in hushed tones, he had noticed them all. It hadn't been his imagination, he hadn't been paranoid. Everything had been exactly what he thought it was. He wasn't wrong. Judge Whittaker broke the silence with a single, deliberate cough, snapping everyone back into focus. "We will proceed with the case as scheduled," she said, her tone firm, almost cold. "However, I want it noted on the record that this court does not tolerate misconduct, especially when it interferes with the pursuit of justice." Crestwell straightened in his seat, his earlier sense of superiority briefly returning, enough for him to scoff dismissively. "Your Honor, I hardly think a minor delay qualifies as obstruction of justice," he said with feigned nonchalance, but the cracks in his voice were starting to show. Without missing a beat, Judge Whittaker shot him a look that could freeze water. "A delay that was deliberately orchestrated with the intent to gain an unfair advantage in this case?" Her voice was cutting, her words precise. "That is obstruction, Mr. Crestwell, plain and simple." A few attorneys in the gallery exchanged looks of understanding. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. With the sharp click of her fingers against the desk, the judge leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she turned her focus back to Officer Sanders. "Before we proceed, I have one more question for you," she said, her gaze cold. "How many times have you followed orders like this before? If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 3 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." The entire courtroom held its breath as Sanders shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A bead of sweat formed on his temple, his body language betraying his nervousness. He hesitated for a long moment, and it was that hesitation, the one that spoke volumes, that sealed his fate. Judge Whittaker's lips pressed into a thin, uncompromising line as she nodded once, signaling the end of Sanders' involvement. "Bailiff, escort Officer Sanders out of the courtroom," she ordered. "He will be placed on immediate leave pending an internal investigation." The room's energy shifted again. The sense of impending consequence was unmistakable now. Sanders didn't resist. He simply stood up, his gaze fixed forward, a man already resigned to his fate. The bailiff guided him out of the room, and the heavy doors slammed shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the courtroom like the finality of a judge's gavel. The moment had been sealed. But Judge Whittaker wasn't finished. Her steely gaze turned back to Crestwell and his legal team. "As for you, Mr. Crestwell," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Bar for legal misconduct. You will answer for deliberately interfering with these proceedings." Crestwell's usual smugness had evaporated, replaced with a tense, defensive posture. His co-counsel shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some of them already scribbling frantic notes, trying to strategize how to minimize the fallout. But there was no fixing this. Not today. Darrell let out a slow breath, his pulse still racing but now with a feeling of relief. For the first time that morning, the oppressive weight on his chest had lightened just a little. It wasn't just a matter of justice being spoken, it was being enforced. As the hearing moved forward, Darrell knew that this was a pivotal moment, one that would echo in that courtroom for a long time to come. When Darrell stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside felt strangely different. The same gray walls, the same sterile tile floors. But the burden he had carried all morning had shifted, and with a deep breath, he adjusted his tie and walked out. It was over. At least, this part was. Crestwell stormed out ahead of him, his usual air of arrogance replaced with a forced, stiff composure that couldn't hide the fact that he knew what had just transpired would leave a permanent mark on his career. The formal complaint from Judge Whittaker wasn't a minor issue. It was the kind of thing that could haunt a lawyer for the rest of their career. And Officer Sanders, at-t. Who had walked out, his head lowered, escorted by the bailiff, knowing his days of unchecked power were coming to a swift end. Darrell should have felt triumphant, victorious. He had won today. But instead he felt drained. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered such subtle, insidious injustices, those quiet wrongs that didn't make headlines but still cut deep. The small injustices that wore you down over time. The ones that made you question if it was even worth fighting back. Today, he had won. But how many had been silenced before they ever had a chance to speak? His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice calling his name. "Carter." Darrell turned to find Judge Whittaker standing near the doors, arms crossed, watching him. For the first time all day, she didn't seem like the stern judge in control of the courtroom. She seemed tired, human, like him. With a soft exhale, she said, "I meant what I said in there. I won't let this go." Darrell gave her a nod. "I know," he replied. She studied him for a moment longer, her gaze lingering before she gave a small nod of acknowledgement. With a final glance at the empty courtroom, she walked away. Darrell lingered in the hallway for a moment, his eyes scanning the familiar check-in desk where his morning had begun. How many others had been told to wait outside, ignored long enough to give up? How many had been silenced, their voices never heard? Not today. He straightened his grip on his briefcase, his resolve firm. He walked toward the exit. Today, the Sistasha has been forced to answer for itself, and maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't forget. As we wrap up today's video, I want to ask you, what have you learned so far? Think about the key moments in Darrell Carter's experience and the lessons that resonate with you. What is one thing that stood out to you, and how will you bring that into your life moving forward? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.